Okay, so I'm going to re-record my video because recording it on the computer, the sound quality was not good. My name is Cello Sherman. Um, this video is for EN 441, Slave Narrative in the U.S., Past and Present, for Dr. Eaton. I've titled my final paper, Finding Home. I've based my paper on Carlson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, and theoretically, my paper, I want to examine and argue that not having a home and being kidnapped from their home and enslaved caused not just physical damage but emotional and psychological damage as well, and that this psychological, mental, and emotional damage, the newly freed slaves and those that were able to escape had a difficult time recovering from all the trauma that was done to them because they did not have a place to call home. I think that this book showcases that in a sense that we see Carlson's Whitehead's lead character, Cora, not able to find a safe place. She does temporarily for a while, and we can see that in that period of time that she's at the farm, she is able to do some healing, but it's not enough. And the story ends that she still does not have a home, but because of her time at the farm, she is stronger, and we do get the feeling that Cora will be all right. The story begins. The story Whitehead introduces us to Cora via her grandmother, who is kidnapped and taken hostage and forced into a life of servitude via the American institution of slavery. My contention is that this act alone was traumatizing, and kidnapping is, by definition, the crime of unlawfully seizing and carrying away a person by force or fraud. And I think there's people that would argue that the slaves were not kidnapped because at the time it wasn't considered a crime, but in all reality, it was a crime that was committed on black bodies en masse. Whitehead goes into detail, and I think he does it in a really nice way, talking about the trauma that the slaves undergo when they are kidnapped. He talks about the things that they're forced to go through on their travel here to the Americas. He also talks about the trauma that some of the slaves were dealing with. One of the things I became early on aware of in his book specifically is some of the things that he talked about. You know, it was obvious that these slaves were suffering from different conditions, different ailments. One of the young women in this particular story was suffering from Tourette's, and Carlson described it as her not being able to control the words that came out of her mouth and having tics. We know that to be Tourette's. He does a good job of laying out some of the traumatic events that the slaves not only underwent themselves, as in Cora getting beaten because she tries to protect a young man. He also talks about how she is dragged behind a shed and raped at the onslaught of her menses when she becomes a young woman. He talks about how she is left orphaned, and how the other slaves, just because she does not have a mother anymore, just move her out of her home, and they attempt to take over the plot of ground that her grandmother has passed down to her mother and then to her. So I think that he does a really nice job of talking about those things. And though the book is fiction, I think his account becomes really important, because a lot of the narratives that we were able to read, and I think a lot of the narratives that were recorded, and I have combed through the slave narratives of during that project where they were gathering the slave stories, and a lot of them just did not want to talk about the severity of the trauma that they went through, and it might have been because they were unable to, because that's one of the symptoms of coming out of a trauma. As such, the individual is also often unable to frame it. Oftentimes they disassociate. Sometimes they're in a denial. So Carlson's story, though fictional, gives us a lot of information and a way of understanding just how bad it was at times for some of the slaves. And I'm sure some of them really had good living conditions, if you could call it that, for being a slave, but none of them were what they should have been for a human being to endure. One of the particular things that I really liked about Carlson's book is though it is fiction, he talks about when Cora makes it to Whitehead's version of South Carolina, we see that there are these people who have crafted this society for the brown people who managed to get free. And one of the things they're doing is sterilizing the women, and they make it seem like it's so nice. It's very Stepford wifey in tone, but that's, though it is fiction, that is not something foreign. That is something that was actually done quite often in this country after black women's reproduction was no longer needed to provide slaves. Black women were often sterilized without consent. And that in itself is another trauma. And so basically my paper seeks to talk about those things that happened to the black body during slavery as a trauma, not just as an incident that happened, but an actual trauma that should be examined that way, both individually and as a group of people. Another thing that stood out to me in the book was when he got to the farm. Whitehead has one of the lead characters, the man who built the farm, give a speech, and the speech is very much reflective of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, both in tone and context, and he talks about the trauma that the black body has experienced and what they've gone through and what that makes them and who they are and how to move forward. And one of the profound things that makes it very Martin Luther King Jr. is that he talks about moving forward, it has to be done across racial lines. The black body and the white bodies have to do this together. I really enjoyed this book. I really enjoyed this course. It was very informative. One of the things that Carlson Whitehead does is, with this book, is bring the issue of slavery to the forefront so that it can be talked about. During my research for this book, I did a lot of research into hostage taking, trauma to the body, what the harm that's caused by being physically assaulted and raped. And I came across an article by Alma Carton where she talks about how slavery's legacy has an effect on the mental health of black people today. And one of the things that she mentioned, much less like the people that Carlson has crafted in his book, is that people don't like to talk about slavery. And unfortunately, it is a conversation that needs to be had. And I feel like this course is one of those courses that brings that conversation to the forefront. I really enjoyed listening to other people's perspective and views and the things that they had to say about the things that we read and learned about in this class. This class is very important to me. I just finished my manuscript. I've titled it Strange Bruised Fruit. And it was, though it's not about slavery, it was influenced by the things that we talked about and things that we read in this class. So I really appreciate this class, and I hope this is a conversation that people get to have more often because it's very, very necessary. Thank you.